Lost Connections by Johann. This book is an analysis of depression, how we treat it in today's society, how we mistreat it, and what the real answers are, according to the author. So the book has three main parts. In the first part, he's talking about his own life story and the role of antidepressants, because he dealt with depression for a lot of his life, and to him, antidepressants were the answer. As he describes in the book, he saw his mind as a bunch of pipes going in all the wrong directions, and then he took the antidepressants and it aligned everything just as it should be. And he talks a lot about this in the book, as seeing depression as a disease that can happen to you at random and is diagnosable as a clear yes or no, like a flu virus. And this idea gave him a lot of comfort in his earlier days when he was depressed, because then he could just say, my brain's out of balance, I've taken this medication, now my brain's back in balance, all is well. But the reason that he wrote the book is that he had a later revelation in life that it's a lot more complicated than that. He started doing research into antidepressants and concluded that they aren't as rock solid as they might seem to be. He brings up two main reasons to be skeptical of the efficacy of antidepressant drugs. One is the fact that a lot of these studies that are done on antidepressants are questionable in their methods. In particular, he brought up a point that an antidepressant drug can come up with 1,000 studies, and they only have to submit the 2 studies of the 1,000 that show that the drug makes a difference to get approved by the FDA. So he makes the case that there's a placebo effect going on there. And the second reason that he's skeptical is the pharmaceutical industry, because they have a serious profit motive. They make tons and tons of money off of selling and marketing these drugs, so their motives might be questionable. He also brings up some interesting points of why our culture is so interested in antidepressants. He mentions how we live in a society where if something's wrong, you do this and then you're fixed. He talks about grief to illustrate his point, because there was a time when you couldn't be diagnosed as depressed in the clinical sense if you just had a loved one pass away. And it used to be that there was like a year around the death of a loved one or some serious incident before you could be diagnosed as depressed. And then over time that shrunk and shrunk and shrunk, and now it's gone. So if you lost someone close to you, you could be diagnosed with depression and given medication right away. So he questions that. Is that grief really worth getting rid of? Is that something that needs to be fixed? Or is it a natural reaction and something we shouldn't mess with like that? In the second part, he gets to his diagnosis of the causes of depression. And the basic idea is where he gets the title of the book, Lost Connections. So lost connections to other people, lost connections to meaningful work, lost connections to nature. And there's a big list of them that he goes through. And I thought this was a very interesting part of the book. I think he makes a lot of interesting points. He makes some solid points about things that we're missing out on in our world of social media, of a world obsessed with money and advertising. And I think this is the firmest ground of the book. And this leads into the third part of the book, where he talks about the solutions. This is where I think he starts to get off the rails. Because I think his general answers to the solutions of depression, i.e. strengthen connections with people, I think that's very sound. He starts to get into very specific and political solutions. And when your solutions are one-sided and very politically oriented, I start to question what's going on here. He talks about universal basic income to reduce inequality in the country. He talks about creating an advertising regulatory body of some kind in the government so that people aren't bombarded with advertisements wherever they go, because he cites that as a problem with people's mental health. And by the end, it seems that he's talking in general about the source of depression being rooted in individualism, materialism, and capitalism. And therefore the solution to depression is social justice causes. I think that's a bit funny to think that if you're depressed, the solution is to be politically active on the national stage. I'm a bit skeptical of that. Also, he talks about the low levels of depression in the Amish community. which he wants to recreate, except without their value system. And so can't help but wonder if maybe the value system has something to do with their low levels of depression, which I think he has just dismissed categorically. I also think he's quick to dismiss the idea of setting meaningful goals for yourself as a way to combat depression. I read earlier in this year the ultramarathon runner who was in a downward spiral. He decided to start running, and it turned everything around for him. I think that is a key. Like, if you give yourself a meaningful challenge, something that excites your mind, I think that is a worthy thing to talk about in a book of depression. But for him, it's all about selflessness and no ego. So it struck me as a bit incomplete. My complaints in the second half aside, I thought the first half was actually very insightful. I think this guy has a solid understanding of depression, so I'm glad he wrote a book about it. I just question his specific prescription. So overall, I give it 4 stars.